Well, thank you, and hi to everyone who is tuning in today, and welcome back to Rabble's Off the Hill political live panel. I'm Libby Davies, and I'm joining you. I'm sorry. I'm having trouble today. I'm Libby Davies. I think that's who I am. I'm your co-host for this month's Off the Hill, and I'm joining you from the unceded, traditional, and ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish Coast Salish peoples. And I'm joined by my regular co-host, Robin Browne.
Hey, Libby. Hey, everybody. I'm joining you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people.
Thanks, Robin. Well, in Canada and across the globe, we have witnessed the weeks of horrendous loss of life and violence in the current crisis in besieged Gaza, the occupied West Bank, and Israel. As people watch in despair and wonder what they can do, another question springs to mind. How much can we trust what we see in the mainstream media? Who is telling the truth? And what part does bias play, or even fake news? There's no question that the media plays a big role in what we see and what we think. So this evening on Off the Hill, we hope to shine a light on the media coverage this conflict has received. We want to look at the biases, the truths, the twists and turns, and we've lined up a special group of panelists who will tackle this very critical question. I'm very happy that we're being joined tonight by Chris Faris Zabenah, a Palestinian Canadian working in leadership, communications, and equity, diversity, and inclusion. Welcome. And Beisan Zubi, a Palestinian Canadian who specializes in equity, anti-oppression, and organizational transformation. Activist and poet Elle Jones, and Rabble's own senior parliamentary reporter, Karl Nerenberg. Welcome to all of you. And also to all of you who are watching on Zoom tonight and participating. We do encourage you to participate in the chat and the polls and ask questions to our panelists through the Q&A function. And we'll certainly do our best to get through as many questions as we can. So first off, I'm going to turn it over to Robin to get us started.
Great, thanks, Libby. And hey, welcome everybody. To open the discussion, I'd like to begin with a general question to each of our panelists, and we'll start with you, Beisan. So first, just tell us what media you're relying on for information about the conflict and what you're avoiding, if anything, and then give us your take on the coverage that you are consuming. So we'll start with Beisan.
So I will be honest, I don't have cable. And so I have watched very few like traditional news media broadcasts about it. The one that I did see was the CBC National, and it was terrible, and I turned it off. There was it actually hurt my feelings. I couldn't watch it. I didn't have any interest in that. I was really disappointed in that. So I have been finding that this time and this kind of like where we are in terms of social media, that the on the ground and actual first person coverage, so from people in Gaza, has just been so powerful and so amazing. And so that is really where I like to go. And so there's three specific young people. One of them is named Beisan, one of them is named Plestia, one of them is Motaz, and they have really, I think, shown such a visceral and devastating truth of what it's like to actually be in that place that you wouldn't get from CNN, who has to run all of their coverage through the IDF. Like, it's really uncensored. It's terrifying. It's devastating what they have been sharing, but it is their truths, and that has been so meaningful, I think, to me, in terms of actually seeing the human impact and not seeing this kind of sanitized, politicized, agendified version of what the news is and what you can and can't say and what will get you, get you in trouble or won't. It's just their realities. And so I would say that has been a bit of a shift for me, because generally speaking, I have been a bit more engaging with traditional media, but this time I really have been getting it straight from the mouths of these young people who are on the ground. And so I would say the format of that has been like Instagram, TikTok, a little bit of Twitter, but really Twitter has been commentary and not as much news breaking because of the just amount of misinformation and disinformation there. Like you can't really know what you're seeing. So yeah, I would say I actually have eschewed traditional media this time and just gone straight to the source. And that has been, I think, what a lot of younger people have been doing. And I think that's what shaped the way younger people and younger generations are actually reacting to this.
No, thank you for that. We'll go to Chris next, but I just want to clarify the IDF you're talking about is the Israeli Defense Force, right?
The IOF, the IDF, yes. They embedded with CNN, I believe, and the conditions of that was that they approve whatever broadcast before it goes to air.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks. Let's go to Chris next, and Chris, then Karl, then Elle.
So I agree with Beisan that the news is rather frustrating. You hear right off the bat from major sources like a CBC, The Star, etc., whether you're reading it or watching broadcasts, language that it seems to be devoid from what's actually happening. It seems to be a lot of he said, she said, they said, or a lot of repeating, like, for instance, Israel says this or military says that, and gone seems to be the analysis. So I tend to look at scan the headlines for what's going on. Then I prefer to go to sources that add context. There's a lot of great ones on Twitter, for example, as well, but really sources like Electronic Intifada or getting commentary from experts like Noura Arakat online. So trying to find out how to put things into context has helped me keep a little bit sane. It's like you have to psych yourself up to go check the news sometimes. If I want to laugh, I'll look at a tweet from CBC Pitchbot, which has been on fire, or something from Norman Finkelstein. But really having this type of commentary from Mohammed Shaheda, for example, or background knowledge information from, for example, Zachary Foster of Palestine Nexus is a great way to keep myself focused. Because if we get lost in what's happening, it's he said, she said, they said. Whereas if we use this time to try and focus with actual understanding and context, helps me keep a little bit more sane. And when I really want to go towards some allies, I'll see what IJV, Independent Jewish Voices Canada, or Jewish Voices for Peace are releasing as press releases, or what some of their folks or people aligned with them are saying, like the great Rabbi David Miviser out of Hamilton. And lastly, of course, I'll go to CJPME, the Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, because they are providing a lot of context and analysis of what's going on and how it's being reported.
Excellent. Thank you. Karl.
So I'm going to be the person here who is the traditionalist, old-fashioned, mainstream, conventional media person, or just out of habit. I have been watching CNN and CBC and reading the New York Times and the Canadian Toronto Star, Globe and Mail. So I do find that whatever I take with respect the comments about CBC's coverage, but I do find that personally it's better, much better than the American coverage, I think. I mean, maybe we can analyze and dispute that. It's not for nothing that the Conservatives have attacked the CBC in Parliament and committee for not, for instance, saying not calling Hamas a terrorist organization, and for not apologizing for having reported that an early, not the hospital that the Israelis are now attacking, but an earlier attack on another hospital wasn't really them, because some Western sources accepted the Israeli explanation that this was done by another organization. So, and not by the IDF. So I do think that I do get, at least from CBC, for instance, they're not processing everything through the Israeli Defense Force, and they will, when they could, they'll call into Gaza and they'll talk to people. They spend a lot more time covering the direct experience to the extent they can. I mean, maybe I worked for CBC a long time and I want to defend them. I know over the years that CBC, and I'm just digressing here, has had people in the region permanently. For instance, Neil MacDonald years ago. I mean, the Jewish community, the very mainstream establishment Jewish community, and I'm connected to them or know those people, they hated him. I mean, they hated him. If one of the Rabinovich brothers walked into a synagogue, everybody would sit on the other side. I mean, that at that time, Bob Rabinovich was president of CBC. But I do also look at, I don't have it on the cable, but I do look at Al Jazeera. They have an excellent program that analyzes media hosted by a Canadian actually called Richard Gisbert. They did a very good, some very good analysis of coverage, international coverage. And there's one, believe it or not, there's a source in Israel, an Israeli newspaper that is much more candid and frank and much more critical, always has been. I've been reading for years, called Haaretz. And I do read that a lot. I actually pay to subscribe to that so I can see what's going on. So I get a variety of sources. I'm not as accustomed to sifting and winnowing out information through social media and things like that. I'm never sure how to use it, but I think I'm showing my age there.
Thanks, Karl. And just before we go to Al, just to clarify something, actually, so Chris put in the chat that he also checks, looks at Al Jazeera English. So just to mention that. And just to clarify, Karl, so for CBC, in terms of what it has to, nothing gets vetted by the IDF? Is that?
You know what? I can't speak for them. I don't think they have people who are, they call this embedded. And I think the way we expressed embedded was the sort of upside down. Journalists get themselves embedded with an army. And this started with the Americans in Iraq and Afghanistan. They wouldn't let people cover the war unless they would be embedded with their troops and be under the control of their troops and only see what their troops let them see, and essentially become a propaganda arm of their military. I don't believe the CBC has chosen to go that route. They do give a lot of airtime sometimes to the Israeli military spokespeople. But again, I noticed an interview with David Cochran at CBC, interviewed this guy. He's a really tough looking guy. I'm sorry, I forgot his name. It's kind of a Conricus or something like that. He's a guy, he's always on, constantly talking. And this guy, he had a completely stroke him, I love you, you're wonderful interview from CNN. When he got it with CBC, he almost took his headset off and left. I mean, he was very annoyed. Like, he says, you're challenging me too much. How dare you challenge anything I say? I'm telling you the truth. Don't you understand? I'm here to tell you the truth. And he was negatively commenting on the report that he heard previously. Well, I think that report is very biased. You're not understanding our position properly. So, I mean, at least the CBC is annoying the IDF. Believe me, CNN never does.
All right, thanks. Elle.
Yeah, I mean, I would add, I guess since I'm last, I get to add a bit, but I think we've seen these stress points in traditional media already, and they come out in these crises. So the inability in many ways of traditional media to deal with this kind of thing. We've seen Palestinian journalists fired. So one journalist from CTV Halifax, I want to get their names right. So Yara Jamal was fired. And then also Zara Al-Akras. So we've seen the firing of Palestinian journalists within Canada. And more broadly, we know that Muslim journalists within newsrooms have spoken about how they're either being silenced or threatened. We've also, of course, seen this vile twisting of language to the point of incomprehensibility in headlines to avoid naming Israel or to avoid actually using any kind of active language. So Palestinians die in explosion at hospital type language that acts like this stuff is just happening. We're seeing this all over the place. The Breach recently did an article showing that on CTV that I think it was 62% more Israelis interviewed than Palestinians, and Palestinians were typically not even given a name when they were interviewed, while Israeli interviewees were constantly identified, given more airtime. So we've seen this kind of bias across media. So as many people, I don't think many people are turning to legacy media at this moment. As everybody else, you're looking on social media where you can get direct footage. We've seen the heroic journalists of Gaza who are really showing up. So many of our craven and cowardly journalists here. We've, of course, seen in response to that direct and targeted attacks on journalists precisely so that we don't have access to this information, which shows us exactly how much fear there is of the kind of coverage we're actually seeing direct from the ground. So we've seen an unprecedented amount of journalists die in Gaza. more than in any other conflict. And not only them dying, but their families being targeted and attacked, which exactly shows what we fear. And we've also heard this rhetoric from everyone from Obama to, this fear of TikTok and social media, precisely because that media isn't being controlled. And when people are seeing the direct images, it's quite uncomplicated to people. So despite what we're told that this is too complex, it's very Orientalist narrative, right? That the mysterious, inscrutable East, that's just too complex for us to understand. So we should just be quiet and not engage. And then, of course, it's not complex to people when they're able to see these images. And we've seen this direct, which isn't new, but a renewed kind of attack on TikTok, for example, because generationally young people are on TikTok. They're seeing this footage directly. They're overwhelmingly recognizing what has happened, calling for ceasefires, recognizing Israel's occupation, recognizing the violence being done. And in return, we've seen all these institutional figures make attempts to shut that down or speak about how this is disinformation, as if we can't receive this direct information. And the final thing I'll say is we've also seen very disgraceful behavior from politicians, such as posting videos that directly contradict what we're being told is said. So, for example, the video of students chanting, "Trudeau, Trudeau, you can't hide," which was misattributed to be "Judah, Judah, you can't hide." And then we saw people like Mark Miller retweet this with no critique, even though we could all clearly hear what the students are saying. These are children and minors that were being targeted by groups like CIJA, that were directly harassing, doxing, targeting these students, claiming they were saying this extremely hateful thing, when we could all watch the video and see they weren't. Those tweets were then taken down with literally no recognition, no apology, no rescinding of the call for these students to be disciplined. And we saw that retweeted by politicians. So we've also seen a real push for disinformation that our politicians are posting. So it's a moment where we really understand that in the West, all of these fault lines we saw in our media, from the treatment of racialized journalists, from the inability to report accurately on the rest of the world, to the way that our politicians jump on issues and the lack of research, and then also these generational issues as well. So I think it's really shown us, and then of course the heroism of our journalist counterparts in Gaza that really put us all to shame.
Well, thanks very much, Ellen, and thanks to all of you for really such illuminating views about your own experiences with media. It's just fascinating to hear the sources that you go to. I'd like to turn now to Chris, because just to kind of focus in on this a bit more, as Chris, you mentioned earlier, Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, and I know you're involved with that organization, as I am actually. And the organization has actually been engaged with media monitoring and accountability on coverage about Palestine and Israel. I mean, a huge project to take on, to try and sort of like do an overview of what's going on in the media and debrief and actually bring forward factual information. So I wonder if you could just take a couple of minutes and tell us about this project that CJPME has going, and why you think it's important to have that kind of media accountability that CJPME is going through.
Certainly, thank you. And of course, full disclosure, I'm on the board of CJPME. I don't have direct say over day-to-day operations. And of course, everything I'm saying today does not necessarily reflect the viewpoints of CJPME. I'm just speaking to the program itself, and I'm here to talk about the good it's done. So we believe it's one of the first in the world that's a systematic advocacy on the media, at least on Canadian media, that's pro-Palestinian. So the idea here is it's helping change the way the media covers Palestine by monitoring, issuing requests for clarifications, challenge them, media sources on accuracy. And what we essentially do is mobilize media responders. So we have services that monitor various news sources. We then send out to media responders who have volunteered to sign up for this, as well as some folks at CJPME. And then we encourage people to challenge media bias that's out there. And of course, we try to correct inaccuracies where they come up. So corrections, I look for apologies, clarifications, and influence how things are presented. So if this initially came up as sort of a response to Honest Reporting Canada, which is an organization that for a long time has had a pro-Israel bias and tend to pressure the media, as well as other sources and other programs that tend to pressure the media to be more pro-Israel, to speak more favorably of Israel. So the idea here is, okay, well, we're going to try and look for inaccuracies, things that are factually incorrect, and biased coverage, and challenge that. We've done a lot here. So some key wins have been things like correcting maps of Palestine. CBC put out a map that included all of Jerusalem and the Golan Heights as part of Israel, where that's not the case. East Jerusalem is considered Palestinian or occupied Palestinian territory. Even since October 7th, we've helped get about 20 letters to the editor published, which have called out inaccuracies and bias and framing in the media. There's been numerous Toronto Star articles that have had corrections printed for things like omission of Palestinian civilian casualties, despite listing the Israeli ones only. Pardon me. When earlier in the year, when Sarah Jama was running, for example, in Hamilton, some clarification and getting papers to clarify that the chants for free Palestine chants, such as "From the River to the Sea," is not in fact anti-Semitic, but is a call for freedom. So the paper went from something like saying, well, this is potentially anti-Semitic to this is, some say, a call for freedom. So it's an improvement. It's a shift away from the previous narrative painting pro-Palestinian activism as anti-Semitic, which of course isn't the case for a whole variety of reasons. Yep. So it's we've had corrections and other things printed in La Presse and Le Trois, The Star, CBC, things that cover violations of reporting standards and referring to Palestine, correcting misinterpretations, and additional historical notes. So it's pretty good stuff, and we'd encourage folks to go check it out at CJPME and look for the Media Accountability Project if they want to find out more or help out.
Oh, that's great. Well, thanks, Kristen. I think it's in the chat so people can track that down, because it is really important to get factual information that's historically correct and to have that media accountability. So very glad to hear that's happening. Back to you, Robin.
Yeah, no, thanks, Libby, and thanks for that, Chris. Thanks for telling us about that project. It's I have to say, in the work that I do, I challenge the media in terms of their coverage of Black people. And I got to say, it would be great to have a project like that, because almost always, including CBC, they come back and say, we did nothing wrong, everything's great. Right? So, and Karl, to you, let's look at the question of media coverage and how it impacts elected representatives. How discerning is the political class? Do our elected representatives care about the truth, or is it more about whatever political stance they want to adopt?
I think it's a bit of a combination of both. I think probably on balance more the latter than the former. But I mean, despite everything we're saying about the inadequacy of legacy media and mainstream media, and I agree with much of it and perhaps most of it, somehow the truth of the horror of what's happening post October 7th, you know, if Israel wanted to be cared about views and opinions, they could have let those events sit after October 7th, when they had the sympathy of everybody. You know, like everybody, very few people were going to sort of applaud what happened. Some did, but very, very few. Very few people would not condemn it or regret it. But you know, Israel itself changed the channel with doing what people like me feared they would do, immediately reacting wildly, madly, almost viciously. So yes, I'm not going to say that I don't think that what happened on October 7th was worse than dreadful and brutal, and it was horrible in the sense that you had one-on-one, you had people committing acts of terrible violence directly in contact. It wasn't this antiseptic dropping bombs. Quite frankly, if you die with it from a bomb dropping on your head or somebody shooting you from a foot away, you're still dead. I mean, I don't think it's any better. And that's what we in the West are doing when we kill people in the developing world. We kill them at a distance. We don't get too close to them. And that's what Israel's been doing. But they completely changed the channel and changed the story so that less than a week later, the victims were all on the other side. The victims are all Palestinian, especially Palestinian children. And, you know, even however inadequate, even members of parliament who would only rely on mainstream media coverage couldn't help but notice that. So you started getting a group in parliament calling for a ceasefire right away, and people moving their position. The NDP moved quickly from, well, we're all for Israel. We support Israel in their time of need to stop. Okay, you more than made your point. This is ridiculous. We have to stop now. Stop killing people. So at the very least, the visceral truth of that has had an impact on members of parliament. I'm not so sure about conservatives. Conservatives, like the right-wing Republicans, have a way of ignoring truth and ignoring what's really happening. But certainly when you hear whatever you think of Justin Trudeau, when he makes this statement that gets Benjamin Netanyahu so annoyed, saying you have to exercise extreme caution. I mean, exercising extreme caution means you do not attack a hospital, period. It's not like you're nice about it. You don't want to attack the hospital only with little bombs or small bullets. You don't go there. You leave it alone. You don't go in killing children and then saying, well, that's calling it collateral damage. So that's even our Liberal Prime Minister was saying that, and it's not for nothing that the Prime Minister of Israel got pretty annoyed. And that is all meaning that however they're getting their information, and of course, the government has other sources of information than the media. So however they're getting it, the ugliness and the brutality and the viciousness of the response is too extreme to ignore.
Yeah, thanks, Karl. And I just want to bring in Elle and Beisan now, because it seems that there's, at least it feels to me, that there's a huge gulf and gap between what I would call sort of the political class and what's being put out in the media through tweets or statements, and what we're seeing in the more sort of activist community. And Beisan, you talked earlier about how you're using direct sources to find out what's happening on the ground. Both of you, Beisan and Elle, you're both very strong activists in the community, and you're both active in social media and in working to bring about change. So I'm just curious as to how you contend with what the media is putting out there on Gaza and Israel, and how have you responded to those narratives yourself, especially where you believe them to be false? What have you been able to do or not do? Are you feeling strong about being able to respond to the twists and the turns and the untruths and the falsehoods? Is it a constant struggle for you, or how are you responding to those kinds of narratives? So why don't we begin with Elle, and then we'll go to Beisan.
Yeah, I think all along what we've seen, and I mean, I want to actually take us back to the World Cup, because I think that was a bit of a presaging of this, where we kept seeing these outbursts at the World Cup that really shocked the Western world, right? Because people didn't really understand the Arab world. And the minute we saw this event within the Arab world, we constantly saw these outbreaks onto the pitch of people running with the Palestinian flag. We saw all these chants of free Palestine. And that was this moment that I think really should have perhaps shown us what was coming and the way that the world was going. But of course, we're so used to having this unified narrative here. I say that because I think what we've seen in this moment is so many people have turned to these direct actions. Quite rightly, we just saw, Trudeau last night going to a restaurant and people saying blood on your hands. We saw the Scotiabank Awards, which really exposed to us, the Giller Awards, sponsored by Scotiabank, where we got a nice view of all our candlelit heroes sneering, shrugging, and being annoyed at the idea of calling for a ceasefire, as if literature is not political, right? So I think we've seen these very effective actions that have gone into intervene into these institutional spaces, from going straight to where politicians are and making sure that they know that people are confronting them. We've seen people pushing back on politicians going to mosques and being like, no, you're not going to come in here while you're doing this to Muslim life. We've seen all kinds of events be interrupted and intervened in. So I think that's very effective. I think, we do have, obviously, it's very difficult in that sense to do the fact check, right? Because this information just moves so quickly. We've seen Israel just delete so much information. They just deleted their tour of the hospital, and there's nothing said about it. It's put out. CNN reported on that ridiculous calendar of terrorists that was just the days of the week. And then these things aren't retracted. They're not apologized for. They're not acknowledged. So you can sort of endlessly bind yourself up in fact checking. And that's part of the point. This propaganda is so bad that it's not even meant to not be transparent. It's not meant to be believable. It's just meant to distract us, to catch us up in a debate, to spin your energy out when you debate. Was it this hospital, that? Was it that? And then you spend a few days doing that, and it's the next thing. So I think quite rightly, many people, while there are people quite heroically intervening in this, what we've really seen is a real turn to very direct action, from going to the weapons manufacturers, from blocking the boats from going out, from intervening with politicians. And I think that's where we really see the strength of this kind of on the ground movement. We've also, of course, seen a huge push by Jewish people that have been going out and getting arrested in very, very public spaces, again, very heroically, and are getting all kinds of criticism in their own communities, being called not real Jews, really facing a lot of stuff that's very difficult, but understanding that they're going out in solidarity. So we've seen this great solidarity that's being built between movements, indigenous people speaking out for Palestine. So even in the midst of this horror and so many failures, I think we've also seen the strength of organizing, that generationally we're seeing stuff across different groups. It's such a diverse coalition of people recognizing that we need to fight what is happening in Palestine for all of our freedom. As many people have said, Palestinians not only, like, they teach us how to be free. And we learn from Palestine what courage is, and we learn how to be free. So I think I don't like to take any moment and be like, it's inspiring when people are dying, because we don't want people to have to die so we can learn something else. But in this moment, I think it really has, we've seen the strength of this kind of organizing and our ability to set new narratives. And we have seen that shift because of so much going on the ground.
Yeah, thanks very much, Elle. And Beisan, over to you. How have you been responding to what you've been seeing, particularly where you think it's false and something needs to be corrected?
I just wanted to really, like, Elle's last point, though, just to bridge off of that, because I think that's so true. And I think that if we hadn't had these sources of being able to see direct action, of young people actually seeing what direct action looks like, it's exciting, it's inspiring, but it's not a coincidence that most of this stuff isn't going to make traditional media. It doesn't work within the system to actually show these kinds of things, because it's something that does catch on. People see people putting their bodies on the line. People see people taking over a train station, and they ask themselves, well, why not me? Why am I not there? And so I think that having social media be the actual kind of all sides view of things, rather than this kind of fake neutrality that I do think a lot of traditional media has, where this is what they say and this is what they say, and there's absolutely that's not even the whole story. That's literally just creating a binary that didn't necessarily exist there. And so I do think that if people had been reliant on just what we had when I was growing up during the Iraq War, we would have seen, for example, people writing petitions endlessly, or writing their MPs, even though we have been doing that has been happening. I think the most signed petition in our history, I think 280,000 signatures across Canada at this point. But yet, our prime minister still hasn't called for a ceasefire. And so where is that disconnect? I do think that as long as people start seeing all of their peers agreeing that this needs to stop, but none of their elected leaders actually responding to that need, they will be transitioning from indirect action into more direct actions like the ones that Elle mentioned. I'd also like to kind of point out, just when I mentioned earlier, misinformation and disinformation, right? There has been so much of it, and it's laughable how bad it is sometimes. Like, there was a video, and it was a woman in Arabic, and the captions in English were completely not what they were saying. but you have to understand that they aren't made for Arabic speakers to understand and believe this propaganda. This is simply for people who are going to watch this on mute or even with audio, but not understand or have any context to understand it. And that is the only point, right? Or just to read the headline. Once you get the headline and you've murkied you've blurred what is truth and what is, it becomes so much more complicated. So the point of misinformation isn't necessarily to be convincing, it's to be confusing. It's to make it so that people don't know what the reality is, and they kind of, excuse themselves from having to be the arbiter of what is true, who can I trust, if you can't trust anybody, right? So I do think that that's why, going back to Elle's point about TikTok, you have all these young people who that's their TV channel. That is their nightly news. That is how they, look for it. And they find people whose work that they trust, and they follow those people and they rely on those people. There's like a meme of so many young people waking up every day and looking to see what has Beisan posted, what has Motaz posted, what has Plestia posted. They have these very strong parasocial relationships now with journalists on the ground, and those relationships never existed before. Journalism was almost like this, separate, elitist, like place where you had to have a very kind of pundit level knowledge to really be in group. And that's no longer the case. There are explainers, there are, it's at every single kind of level. There's introductory to advanced. And so I do think that shift has been so hard for the, the system to actually counter. And so you're seeing like the ADL being like, TikTok is ruining us. This is generational. They have been framing it as left versus right, but really what it is younger versus older, and how younger people are choosing to, to find information, how they're choosing who to trust and who not to trust. And so I do think that, that misinformation piece is honestly, and this is my worry, there are people who are only taking in the sources that are not questioning authority, that are not like, when an article says like Israel says, I don't put very much credence into the words that come after that. I'm Palestinian. I've been Palestinian my whole life. Israel misconstruing the facts is not new. But now people actually, because they've had to be on the spot and make up and have all of these things all the time, and because they're being held accountable, because videos coming of a massacre that would have never come out, 10 years ago, all the time, because they don't stop, they have to churn out so much content and so much information that they're getting like stuck on all of these things that they've had to, to fabricate. Like there was a video that was two people speaking, that two Hamas terrorists was what they said, speaking Arabic. Neither of them spoke Arabic really well. Like it makes no sense. But if we didn't have a bunch of Arabic speakers who were able to actually say, no, smells fishy, this isn't real, we don't trust it, most people would have just believed that misinformation that was put out by the state. So I do think there's a lot of fact checking coming out from social media.
Yeah, there is. And I think you've made that point quite brilliantly. So I think we've got a couple more questions. I'm going to turn it back to Robin before we hopefully have time to get some audience questions. So Robin, back to you.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Libby. Actually, you guys have all covered pretty well. Our next question was going to be, what advice do you give to people to keep themselves well informed? But you've covered that very well. So I'm going to go to a question directly for Elle. So Elle, Palestinians and Black folks have been involved in liberation struggles for a long time. Right? Nelson Mandela said, "quote, our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians," unquote. How does media coverage of the Palestinian struggle against occupation, including the crisis in Gaza, compare to coverage of Black resistance movements in Canada?
Well, I mean, we know that Nelson Mandela was called a terrorist until he wasn't. And then it was the opposite, where then we got a whitewashing of Mandela and, he loves the Springboks, and then we lost the access to the revolutionary history. We saw during the movement for Black Lives, Initially they were called terrorists that were hijacking the Pride Parade, for example. And we also see, perhaps more dangerously, how media will concede space, particularly right-wing media. So if you go back to, for example, looking at the coverage of BLM, first they were doing a hostage taking and terrorizing the march, and there was no racism in Canada, and this was all delusional. And then if you look at the same columnists, a year or two later, now they're acknowledging that, perhaps, yes, the police do racially profile, but the way you're going about it is. So I think we also have to be careful of how the media shifts to accommodate. So sometimes you go, well, we're making progress because now they acknowledge police brutality, but it's never done in a way that is, they only concede the ground that they think they've lost in order to hold further ground against your liberation struggle, right? And so we're starting to see this already, right? Where politicians walking back into humanitarian pause or something, so that they still don't have to address the actual issue. And I think that is something that we've learned from Black liberation struggles that we actually, in some ways, have to be more wary of. In some ways, when the media is just being blatantly racist, Glenn Coulthard talks about this, right? The politics of recognition, that often under a kind of liberal framework, you're worse off than under just a blatantly hostile regime, because when it's just hostile and you're completely dehumanized, we all like on board with fighting the enemy. What becomes more difficult is when there will seem to be concessions, small ideas of humanization, to sort of encourage, like, give them time, let them wait, and this is, of course, MLK's point about the liberal, right? That in many ways, the white liberal, as he put it, is more dangerous to you than the dedicated segregationist. So I think that's something to look out for. But, we've always known that we will be unfairly covered. We've always known the way that our voices will be clipped. We've always known that there will be divide and rule tactics, that if you can find one person to defend something, these are not new tactics. And people have been in the struggle a long time. So I think we all know that you have to focus on organizing, that you have to focus on building your own organs, finding ways to share information. In many ways, you can't pay attention to those kind of voices, and you have to focus on the work that you're doing and build those counter platforms. So I think we've seen all of that. And it's true for any struggle. We've seen this post 2020, where we got, the brief George Floyd moment, and then completely what we've lived out for the next at least 2 years has been this backlash on woke, on CRT, on, queer rights, which is also attached to that. So we know that this also happens, that the more that people see that the state is being punctured, that in this case, a global puncturing of, it's not just Israel, right? Like, this isn't, like, it's not like Israel created any of this stuff. Every single mechanism they're seeing here is what we see in every settler colonial state. We see this across the world, which is why the global South is universally pushing back and saying, because we recognize this. We recognize how our struggles are deemed terroristic. We recognize how our land and resources are extracted. We recognize these tactics of occupation, of imprisonment, of profiling. Like, this is not new. So I think we're well versed in how this takes place. And I think what's perhaps coming through in this moment is exactly how much people are recognizing that the liberation that we have been told that we possess in the West, that we're so free, we're so democratic, we're so lucky. Yes, we are not being bombed, so we are lucky compared to a child in Gaza. But we also know that our nations are so complicit in all this because they do the same things. And so I think it's also raising for a lot of people, if people were not aware of the realities of what these cultures look like, of what our states are also violently based on, I think it's bringing that home to people. And that's why we've also seen Indigenous people recognizing the struggle as well. So I think we're very just familiar with this. And as a result, we're seeing this push against it.
Thanks very much, Ellen. That's actually a good segue to some of the questions that are coming in from people who are tuned in today. And one of the questions is focusing on just as the violence against Gaza started before October 7th. I mean, we've talked a lot about October 7th and on, and just the horrific things that have happened. But there, of course, this all predates October 7th. There's a lot of history and context. And so one of the questions that's come in is, how has the media coverage been in the decades leading up to this particular moment in time? And another question that's related to it, one of our listeners has said, to what extent has Israel financial and military support for Hamas in the past being ignored by the mainstream media. So I think it's, so much of the context of this debate is so critical, right? And Beisan, I really liked what you said when you say that a lot of the mainstream media, their goal is to just confuse people, right? To make people say, well, I don't understand what's going on. I can't wrap my head around that. People just tune out. But so the historical context is so important in terms of what happened prior to October the 7th. We're talking about decades here in terms of illegal occupation and militarization and violence and death. So I'm going to start with you, Chris, like in terms of just thinking about the media coverage and even the question of, the history of Hamas and support by Israel previously. How does that play into it? If you feel like you can answer that, if you can't, don't worry about it. And then maybe Karl, you'd like to make some comments on that as well. So let's start with Chris.
A couple of things. First off, this idea of talking about we keep saying what's happening in Gaza. Let's keep happening in Gaza. This idea of Israel-Hamas war. Well, first off, you can't declare war on people that you occupy. Secondly, Hamas is a militant group. It's an organization. It is not something that represents a country or all Palestinians. And additionally, calling it, I'm not saying just you, but in general, the media uses the term just Gaza. Well, it's erasing Palestinian identity. It's not like the West Bank is fine. It's horrible. There's been more hostages taken by the state of Israel. They're calling them detainees or questioning, but there are very credible reports of them being beaten quite severely. And there's something around 10,000 or more now Palestinian political prisoners and administrative detainees held often without charge for an indefinite amount of reoccurring time. So this isn't being covered. So this idea of it just being about Gaza is additional dehumanization and makes it seem like everything else is fine. And as many folks have pointed out, Erakat and others, what does Palestine look like without Hamas? The West Bank. And there's still colonization, dehumanization, settler pogroms and violence and killing of Palestinians, stealing their homes, etc., and on and on. So what I see is really all this change is the rate of change of genocide has changed from what it was before to slightly faster, or I guess a lot faster now. And once there is an eventual, inshallah, hopefully eventual ceasefire, then it's just going to go back to a slower genocide until things are changed. How does this come back to the idea of what's going on with Hamas? We were talking earlier about media sources. And of course, thank you, Karl, for also bringing in Al Jazeera. How could I forget that? And Haaretz and Gideon Levy, as he's known in some circles as the, quote, most hated man in Israel, close quote, because of his strong criticism of the governments there and their actions. If I have to watch traditional media, I try to do so through, this is terrible, late night television, only because it's the way sometimes I can only stomach the ridiculous news coverage. And there was something on John Oliver was talking about in a recent challenging and problematic in other ways segment about Palestine and Gaza, what's going on at the moment. He talks about the bags of cash that Netanyahu was sending to Hamas to prop it up. And there's plenty of sources out there that can describe the history of how Hamas was created, not created exactly, but funded, and its current incarnation was very strongly created by Israel. They can describe that better than I can, but it doesn't fundamentally change the fact that making it all about Hamas is, as Beisan and others are talking about, it's as an aspect of this distraction. It's not just about Hamas. It's about the ongoing occupation that create the conditions for Hamas to flourish. I don't like Hamas. I don't want them to be around. I don't believe they should be engaging in violence. I don't believe anyone there should be engaging in armed violence, but that's what's happening. And the conditions are being created by and spurned by Israel. So as far as other aspects of media coverage, I think I lost the thread of the question, getting frustrated.
That's okay.
With television there.
That's okay.
But it's not just about Gaza. It's about all of Palestine, and it's about the conditions that are going on, and it's about the way that we're talking about it as if, oh, if only the Palestinians over the years would just listen. It's a very patriarchal tone towards these pesky Palestinians. If they would just take these good deals that are being offered to them, then everything would just be fine. And it's not. And of course, those sentiments are in line with some, as Elle was saying, the MLK's white moderate who will do nothing and say nothing because it's quote unquote so complicated that they don't take action.
There's a lot of ground that we've covered tonight, so I really appreciate that you're all just diving in there and trying to answer the questions. That's great. So Karl, just any comment that you want to add in terms of more historical coverage of the questions that came in around that, and what that means in terms of media accountability, the historical background to leading up to October 7th.
So I think what Chris has been talking about is really key, because the key to this whole story is, in a way, what has been going on in the West Bank, not what has been going on in Gaza. And it seems to me that what we have failed to cover and pay attention to in the West, that really was extremely accelerated with the current government of Israel, with the coalition, not the new government that Netanyahu created at the last minute, but the government that he had, the coalition with fascist elements, with people who the Israeli army wouldn't even take. I mean, they thought they were so crazy and so extreme, even the IDF didn't want them. That their policy has been actively to accelerate colonization of the West Bank, to make anything resembling a viable state impossible, to terrorize and try to discourage and scare away the Palestinians, and to run that. I mean, you know, they could be debatable whether within the pre-67 borders, Israel is exactly an apartheid state, because what we used to call the Israeli Arabs, the Israeli Palestinians, do enjoy many rights. But the West Bank is like, I was in South Africa during apartheid. I visited Israel and Palestine in 2012. That is an apartheid state. That is a purely apartheid state. And you know what? The apartheid regime at its end, what they wanted to do was say that all the Black people of South Africa were no longer citizens of South Africa. They were citizens of these Bantustans, little pockets and tiny little, they'd have like some territory of 7 little pieces that they then recognized as independent countries. I mean, the South Africans put up an embassy in this place. It would be like, you know, the Canadian government putting up an embassy in a First Nations reserve somewhere. And that is what their policy has been, and which we've not paid any attention to. And Benjamin Netanyahu was quoted in Haaretz saying a few years ago, and somebody wrote an analytic article, look, I won't apologize for helping Hamas effectively, for allowing them to thrive. The greatest threat to us isn't from violence from Hamas. It is from world opinion being able to pressure us diplomatically to create a two-state. The two-state solution is the greatest threat to Israel. What we want is one state, and what we want effectively is the current putative one nation state of Palestine on the West Bank to become simply part of Greater Israel. You know, and that is their plan, and they were doing well with that plan, and we didn't cover that. So how do they effectuate that plan? They made friends with the extreme reactionary elements in the Arab world, in the Gulf, and almost in Saudi Arabia. They were going to have their plan validated by the Saudis. And this, of course, is what set Hamas off. Finally, that was what triggered Hamas. Now, Hamas is essentially a nihilist organization that only wants, but they're both nihil. The Israelis want this form of nihilism where they're going to terrorize the Palestinians sufficiently on the West Bank so they'll ultimately somehow disappear or be enclosed in smaller and smaller enclaves. And Hamas, their version of things is they don't mind how much violence there is. They're hoping this draws in other people. They've succeeded in one thing. The Saudis have walked away from the table. You don't hear talk about the Saudis recognizing and getting
Karl,
together with Israel now.
Yeah, Karl, I'm going to jump in there because we've got some other questions that have come in that are really great that we want to try and get to. So I'm going to just flip it back to Robin to try and get to the last couple of questions before we have to close off. Thanks, Karl.
No, thank you. This is great. This one will be for Beisan and Elle. I'm not helping yet. I guess there's been many calls for a ceasefire. What would a ceasefire really look like? And are, quote, humanitarian pauses to evacuate people enough? Let's go with Beisan, then Elle.
And short responses if you can, because we've got another
question. It's repugnant. The idea of a humanitarian pause should not be on the mouth of any person who respects humanity. The idea of feeding and giving water to people so that they can be bombed some more is disgusting. And it shows exactly how morally decrepit our society is, that we would say that this is humanitarian. It is not humanitarian. It is the opposite of humanity. No.
Okay.
Elle?
I said very briefly, we are, people on the ground in Gaza have said ceasefire, but ceasefire with the expectation that you push the end of the occupation past that. So the ceasefire is an extremely short-term idea. I think the problem is if people only say ceasefire as if that's the solution, and then nothing else changes. So it can't be ceasefire back to status quo of occupation apartheid. It's ceasefire and then pushing for Palestinians to actually have human rights. But yeah, I'll just say that.
Yeah, great. And there's one more question that came in. Maybe this can go to Chris because we just got a couple minutes left before we wrap up. Al Jazeera did a good show on Western media coverage where a panelist talked about the silence of Western media about all the journalists who have been killed in Gaza. Any comment on that? That's the question that came in.
It's hard to comment on just how many things Western media is overlooking. But what I can wonder is for a Canadian or North American journalist to look the other way and not feel outraged that their colleagues are being targeted, continually targeted, but well before Shireen Abu Akleh last year, continually targeted at almost, I think it's one or more per day at this point, and not be outraged and not truly challenge not just our leaders, but Israeli journalists and Israeli sources on that is beyond me. And I would echo Beisan's note about it's a signaling just how bad things have gotten. And if even the media sources are not willing to challenge their own colleagues across the world being killed, then the racism is evident.
Thanks, Chris.
I just want to mention,
Thank you.
So we just shouldn't forget that not only these journalists killed, they even killed the entire family of Al Jazeera's main correspondent in Gaza, and he went back to work the next day. And of course, Al Jazeera itself covered this very well, but also the enormous number of people working for the United Nations. I mean, it is I've never heard, this is unbelievable. Over 100. No, and they don't dispute it. They don't dispute it. Of course, the extremists in Israel and despise the United Nations.
No, thank you, Karl. No, thank you to everybody. That's all the time we have for questions for today and for the panel. So thank you to all our guests, Beisan, Elle, Chris, and Karl for joining us today. Our live political panel Off the Hill will return next month. And as a reminder, we now have a regular day set for the series. You can join us for Off the Hill every third Wednesday of the month, every month, which means our next Off the Hill will happen December the 20th. So be sure to get an invitation for that event by signing up for Rabble's newsletter at rabble.ca/subscribe. And finally, a big thank you to Rabble for hosting events like this. To keep events like this going, please consider supporting Rabble by making a one-time donation or becoming a monthly donor at rabble.ca/donate. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and we will see you next month.
Thank you, everyone. You did great discussion tonight. Thank you so much.
Thanks, folks.